G'day, welcome to the Sunday Shot. I am Dave Milner, the editor of The Shot. I am speaking to you on Wurundjeri land, and I am joined today by an excellent panel. We are going to be talking about fascism, because, God, that's a fun topic. I am joined by, as ever, Jo Dyer, difficult woman extraordinaire. Jo, how are you?
I am very well, thanks, Dave. Good to be here. Good to be being difficult.
Excellent. We've got another difficult woman with us. Lucy Hamilton is joining us. Lucy, hi.
Yep, difficult too.
And Joel Jenkins, who is difficult in his own ways. Joel, it's a pleasure to have you. How are you, mate?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me on.
It is our pleasure. Or perhaps that's not the right word given the topic matter that we're going into. Before we get there,
Little
Jo,
roundup of the week.
What's been happening this week other than the fascism?
Well, so I think the few things the Royal Commission into Bondi and anti-Semitism more generally got underway. Already there's been some disappointment expressed, particularly by the Jewish community and those directly affected by the horror of December 14, because they have been told that they will not be invited to give personal testimony, eyewitness testimony of what actually happened on that horrible night. Because, of course, you can't risk prejudicing the criminal case which is underway. This was always the risk of having the commission held now. That was why there had been some opposition expressed, particularly by legal experts, to having them running concurrently. But we are where we are. Dennis Richardson's report, he's now been folded in as a special advisor to the commission, but we've already learned that probably the failings of the security agencies will not be able to be referred to in the interim report, simply because the secrecy in the labyrinthine world of the security agencies is unlikely to be able to be in any way unpicked by April. That's such a short time.
Horror.
Yeah, Susan Lee, she has finally resigned from Farah as predicted, and that is setting up a three-cornered contest, it seems, on the right between the Nats, the Libs and One Nation. One Nation is courting the current New South Wales independent member for the seat of Murray, Helen Dalton, to be their candidate. There does seem to be a real increase in interest, people who are One Nation curious, shall we say, because they had over 300 people turn up to a public event that they held in Albury. Helen Dalton, look, she's been a Nat, she's been a shooter and a fisher, now she's an independent. She'd have to resign her New South Wales seat if she wanted to run. So whether or not she's up for doing that and embracing her third political party, who knows? Whoever that candidate is, and whoever those candidates are, probably more accurately, hopefully their key opposition will be the community independent Michelle Millthorpe, who ran at the last election and came very close. Labor, it seems, is not going to bother to run. Joel, I guess it's one of those situations that when you've got, your enemies fighting it out amongst themselves, it's already going to be such a scrap, they may as well just sit back from the sidelines and hope Millthorpe does well.
Yeah, potentially so. And it seems like around that Albury area, there's just a lot of contests for Lee's seat that was pre-existing anyway. I've got a mate that lives out in the Beechworth area, and it has been saying there has been some interest for some time in Lee's seat from these alternate parties. And yeah, interesting that this One Nation's, choosing it as a real, potential pivot point in where it wants to go electorally moving forward.
The other thing that's been happening this week is in the New South Wales Court of Appeal. We have the first of what seem to be an array of High Court challenges coming down in relation to both the Commonwealth and the New South Wales, and potentially even in the future, the Queensland laws enacted against the anti-hate laws, which are prescribing organisations, prescribing some forms of speech, And potentially that includes even some particular phrases and slogans. So, as we foreshadowed, we have got everybody's favourite constitutional law expert on to just give us an overview of these particular cases. So, earlier this week, I did an interview with Anne Twomey, who will enlighten us about some of these cases. Before we begin, can I ask you to talk a little bit about the implied freedom of political communication? Because that's really that's forming the basis for a lot of the challenges.
Sure. So we don't have a freedom of speech in our constitution. We don't have a Bill of Rights or anything like that. In 1992, the High Court said, well, what we do have in the constitution is something that says that the Houses of Parliament have to be directly chosen by the people. And if you're to have a choice and a genuine choice, that requires you to be able to have the capacity to develop your political consciousness, your desire to vote for one side or another. And that means that you need to be able to engage in political communication, so both convey your views and receive information in order to be able to fulfill that role of being able to vote, both in elections and also in referendums. But of course, all rights are not absolute, and the High Court's been quite clear about this as well. So what it says is that if a law of the Commonwealth or a state burdens your implied freedom of political communication, so that means that it restricts it. If it does that, the law will be invalid unless the law is made for a legitimate purpose that's consistent with the constitutional system of government, and it's reasonably appropriate and adapted to achieve that purpose. Now, that's a lot of legal talk, but what they're really trying to say is, are you seriously trying to achieve that other purpose? And if you are, you're going to narrowly focus your law to achieve that purpose in a way that has as least a possible restriction on your freedom of speech, political communication. So that's essentially the test, and that's the one that will arise in all these cases and issues as we go through.
If we can turn to the suite of anti-hate laws which have been enacted both at a state and a Commonwealth level, if we can look at the groups first, it looks like we've
Yep.
got the Nazis underway to challenge the proscription of groups. At the very least, we've got crowdfunding happen to try and get that
Goodness.
up. This is a new kind of proscription that we haven't seen the like of before, or at least not since the federal government tried to outlaw the Communist Party and things like that. Is that right?
Yes and no. So we do have legislation in existence that prohibits certain terrorist groups and sponsors of state sponsors of terrorism. So those laws already exist, and there's something like, I don't know, about 30 odd organizations, including Hamas and Hezbollah and
Yep.
whatever, that are already declared to be terrorist organizations. What's different about this is that it's not confined to terrorism or something of that kind. It could be it's organizations that have engaged in hate crime. And quite bizarrely, the legislation says, well, you can be banned for engaging in hate crime, but it doesn't actually have to have been a crime when it was committed. And no crime needs to necessarily have been committed in order to have been found to have engaged in a hate crime. So one of the problems with the law is that it's drafted very broadly because they know there are two particular groups that they want to pick up, and they've been frustrated at not being able to deal with these groups anymore because, shock horror, they have acted in a way that was consistent with the law. So they've stayed within the law. And so in order to catch them, they need to find ways of doing so. And in particular, what they're doing here is saying, well, if you did something in the past, which was perfectly legal in the past, but might satisfy the terms of what's now a hate crime, well, that's enough to say that you're an organisation that's engaged in hate crimes, therefore you're going to be prohibited. So while I can understand why they want to do that in the circumstances that we're facing now, the thing that really worries me about it is how having that kind of a law on the books could be used in the future in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time. If you had some kind of populist government that wanted to get rid of its enemies, it's a very good mechanism to be able to do that. And so I think these kinds of laws, while I can sympathise with what they were trying to achieve, I don't think laws drafted this broadly should be put on the statute book.
Look, let's move to the state laws, and we'll
Sure.
start with New South Wales.
Yeah.
As we speak, there is legal action underway in the New South Wales Court of Appeal in a case brought by the Black Caucus, Palestine Action Group, and Jews Against the Occupation, saying that the anti-protest laws that were brought in gives the police just too broad and uncontrollable a power in relation to where and how protesters can assemble. Can you give us a bit of an overview of that?
Yeah, that one's a really odd one because it's always talked about as a ban on protests, and it's not a ban on protests, and the law doesn't do that. But I think one thing it does do, and I've seen this in relation to a number of things, and this includes, what's sometimes described as the social media ban for under 16, same sort of problem. What we're seeing these days is because we have the implied freedom of political communication, and because they have to be careful about the laws that they enact, parliaments will enact laws in such a way as to try and make sure they're not so burdensome on political communication that they'll get knocked down by the High Court. But at the same time, the politicians and the people talking about the laws talk them up in a way to make them seem to be bigger and broader than they are. So with the social media ban, they kept on saying, well, young people under 16 are banned from being on social media. Well, actually, the law doesn't say that at all, right? The law's just there saying, you can't have an account for these sorts of things, but you can see all the social media you
Yeah.
want on those accounts, on those platforms that don't use an account for that purpose. Same here in relation to the protest laws. So you got, politicians and at some stages even the police saying that these are bans on protests when they weren't. What the law actually does is it prevents the people who are organising a protest from going through a process with the police that would give them a degree of immunity from particular offences. And so the main one of those is blocking a road or a footpath. So you can still perfectly validly hold your protest, but if you disrupt traffic or you block people on the footpath, then you may be committing an offence. Okay. So you saw sometimes with these protests, people saying, all right, well, what we'll do is we'll have a single file protest. We will go through the city, we will move and we'll do it in single file and we'll stop at the traffic lights and we won't disrupt or block anyone. And you still saw the police saying, no, you can't do that. Well, the reality is the law says you can because there's nothing in there that stops people from, legitimately walking down the footpath.
And that was some
And
of the issues that we had in relation to the recent protests where the Muslim gentlemen were praying. They seemingly weren't blocking egress at all. They were there, but they were still sort of violently pulled up and told to move
and
on.
so look, I was wondering about that too, because there are two things that this law did in relation to protests. So one of them was removing the possibility of immunity from that provision in the Summary Offences Act, which is about obstructing persons and traffic in a public place. But the second thing was it allowed the police to give move-on orders. Okay, and that was one of the issues that happened there. But if you look at the terms of the move-on order, the police can only do it again if persons are obstructing traffic or people. Okay, and that wasn't happening there, or if the people's conduct constitutes harassment or intimidation or is likely to cause fear to others. And that's the only justification for doing the move on order. And so you're asking yourself, well, how did people praying in a square that wasn't even a footpath or a road What's the assessment being made there that that's actually constituting harassment or intimidation or causing fear to others? I mean, I find it quite hard to understand. Now, having said that, I do need to qualify that, because what the New South Wales government also did at that stage was it brought in to play certain laws that dealt with major events legislation. So I don't know what's in the major events legislation. It's possible there was something there that allowed the police to go further in terms of move on orders, etc. But the powers of the police under the move on orders as a consequence of those changes that were made in relation to protests and the making of a PARD, which is a Public Assembly Restriction Declaration, are quite limited. And so this comes back to the issue then, if you're actually challenging this in a court, because it's not outright stopping protests, people might have been told or believed they weren't allowed to protest, but actually they were allowed to protest. The law didn't do that. Makes it harder when you try and challenge it in a court, right? Looking at the law itself, there were some aspects that showed that they did try to limit its application. So they limited, for example, the period of time that the law could apply for. So there were 14-day intervals in which it applied, and it could be extended only up to a certain maximum time. So that's trying to narrow its focus, and that's a good thing if you want constitutional validity. But on the other side of the equation, the area in which it could happen was extremely broad. It didn't seem to have to be tied to the existence of the prior terrorist event. And secondly, it applied to any type of public assembly. It didn't have to be one that would cause fear. It applied to all sorts of public assemblies. So it was way too broad on that regard. So when you're looking at from a court's point of view, it's going to say, okay, well, what's the level of restriction on the burden? All right, on the one hand, you can still protest. But on the other side of the equation, you would say, well, is this law reasonably and appropriate and adapted to achieve, a legitimate end of protecting the public, etc.? Well, no, it's awfully broad. It applies to all sorts of different protests, or not even just protests, any kind of public assembly, and in all sorts of places around the state potentially. So it's going to be a really interesting balancing exercise for the court when it looks at that.
So post Bondi, the New South Wales government also enacted a new package around criminalising some types of speech, including enacting a new criminal offence for intentionally and publicly inciting racial hatred. What was the distinction between the suite of laws they passed after the Dural Caravan incident and these newer laws that they passed in January? Because it does seem that there is now this veritable web of laws which are all doing very similar sorts of things when it comes to hate speech.
Yes, they are. And I have to say that I've got to the point that it's doing my head in, because I keep having to read all these different laws from different jurisdictions, and they're all slightly different. So one of the big differences in these sorts of things is, there's two flipping points. One is the point at which we flip from dealing with issues at a civil level to a criminal level. So when we criminalize things. So previously, when we dealt with things like, inciting hatred against people, it was actually an issue at the civil level. And the view had been taken in the past that criminal law can't change the hate in a person's heart. It's not actually going to achieve an outcome. And a better way of dealing with this is by sort of processes of conciliation and discussion and trying to get an agreed outcome. And so that's why in the past we've had anti-discrimination bodies, human rights bodies, and people can go and complain to them and say, look, this person's done this thing. It's absolutely terrible. It's upset me terribly. And they get brought in, and then they get to discuss it and conciliate it and hopefully come out with a good outcome. Okay, so that's how we've dealt with things in the past. Now we're seeing a much harder line and just flipping it over into no, we're just going to make it a criminal offence and send you to jail. Okay, and so somehow by criminalising this kind of conduct, that will improve social cohesion. And that's the step that I don't really understand. I'm not actually sure that there's evidence that shows criminalizing saying certain things will lead to social cohesion. And I don't know that anyone's ever fully explained how that actually works. The second kind of flipping point is that the things that we've criminalized in the past are things about inciting violence against people. So if you incite violence against a group on the basis of their race or various other attributes, then that has always, for a long time been regarded as a criminal offence.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing there is you're connecting the words that are being used to an outcome, which is an outcome that is one that forms traditionally part of the criminal law. So violence against people, and in particular, also damage to property. So, damaging someone's car, putting graffiti on their house, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And so they are ordinary criminal offences, and in inciting or advocating for people to do those criminal offences has been regarded as criminal. But what we're now seeing is a flip from that, where you had to connect it to some kind of violence or damage, to saying, no, the crime is just the saying of the words, regardless of whether there is any connected type of criminal outcome. And so we've seen recently both of those flipping points happen.
And at the moment, there's no challenge underway for that particular part of the law.
Not that I know of off the
No,
top of
not
my
yet.
head, but,
No,
you
no.
never know. There
You
might
never
be
know.
some
You never
lurking
know.
around.
And just finally, we have heard Chris Minns talk a lot about how he would like to ban certain slogans, certain
Yep.
phrases. Hasn't enacted laws at the moment because that's being examined by a parliamentary inquiry. Now, in particular, it's From the River to the Sea, and Globalise the Intifada. I'll say them so that you don't have to.
Good-o.
Because in Queensland, the Christopher government has banned these phrases, or has certainly banned, broadly speaking, particular hate phrases, and has used these two as examples. Now, that would certainly seem to me, anyway, to be ripe for a constitutional challenge as well under this implied right to political communication.
Yes, I would imagine. So, to be clear, as far as I know, there's a bill in Queensland. I don't know that it's been enacted yet. It might have been since I looked at
Oh,
it,
right,
but
okay.
certainly there's a bill, and I've looked at the bill. I made a submission to the parliamentary inquiry about the bill, so there has been a parliamentary inquiry held very quickly in Queensland about it. And the way the bill works is, and whoever drafted it, by the way, was quite clever from a constitutional point of view. So they're making it as hard as possible to challenge. So the way it works is that the bill, the law will work in generality and say, okay, the minister can make a regulation banning particular expressions in certain circumstances. And so we don't see in the legislation any express banning of a particular slogan. If they had done it that way, if they just said and passed a law and said, this particular slogan is, it's a criminal offence to recite it, full stop. That would be very easy to challenge in the High Court, because one of the things the court is quite conscious about is that if the law is directed to particular political content, then you need to have a sort of a higher, you need to have a compelling reason in order to be able to ban particular political content. They're much more accepting of laws that are of general application. It doesn't matter whether you're on this political side or that political side. That kind of thing is more likely to survive scrutiny. But once you start targeting particular political content, and the court talks about the free flow of political communication. So once you start favouring one side of a political argument over another, then it's going to be much harder to defend in the High Court. So cleverly, the law doesn't do that at all. What it does is allow a minister to then get a regulation made which does the banning. Now, because of another weird High Court judgment, the High Court says, well, for a constitutional challenge, we look at the level of the statute. We don't look at the level of the regulation. And if you want to challenge the regulation, you have to do that as a matter of administrative law, or you'd have to be arguing that the regulation wasn't validly sort of made under the scope of the statute. It's all a bit messy from a legal point of view, but, whoever did it was very clever by putting it into that category, making it harder to challenge. Nonetheless, the fact that politicians have actually said, I believe, that it's only those two slogans that are going to be banned, and that's the purpose of the law, that might sort of, help tip it along into an area of challenge.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So this week, you may have noticed that Joel and I got together, bashed our nervous systems into a wall, and we decided that it would be useful for just a collage of all these fascist incidents that we've seen in this country to exist in one place, because one way this is obscured in the mainstream press is all these incidents are siloed from each other. The cause and the effect are disconnected. We just see random chaos. But we should acknowledge that actually these are patterns, these are disturbing patterns, and that there are clear causes for them. So just so we're defining terms, so we know what we're talking about. I'm not going to read the article, but I will. These are some of the sub-headlines that we had in it. Border security is receiving anti-Semitism training. Federal police raid a Canberra bar for displaying anti-fascist art. New South Wales police brutality against anti-genocide protesters. Immigrant crime data being shared with the US Epstein regime. That's what I'm calling them now. New South Wales police trialling drone surveillance, refugees being forcibly removed from the Australian community, Zionists overseeing a re-engineering of our school curriculum, continued Israeli weapons contracts, the Segal doctrine of cutting university funding for perceived anti-Semitism, which of course will hinge on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, Alcoa granted legal exemption to strip mine native forests for the US military, all the Writers' Festival bullshit, Theo Nolan Isles being locked up for a tweet, climate protesters being arrested, and on and on. There is quite a trend here. And I wanted to talk about what's going on right now because no one else is, apparently. Lucy, what's going on right
Yes. Well, we've had 2 Atlas Network connected conferences in Sydney this last week, and I think the Atlas Network fits in perfectly to what you're talking about. So for those who don't remember from other times, it's a series of think tanks that's part of the infrastructure that created neoliberalism from the Second World War on. And it's really important to remember that it's a Cold War movement. So it stood absolutely in its forebears and in the actual think tank network against communism. And it saw communism everywhere. So communism was in the civil rights movement, in the student protests on campus, in women and people of colour gaining rights that previously only men had. So throughout it, you've got a bunch of people who are absolutely determined that anything that moves away from that old sort of patriarchal white supremacist state is communism. And I think that pervades it. So it goes under the banner of freedom, but it's only freedom for those old white men who share their ideas. And, anyone who's willing to go along and help. It's not freedom for any of the rest of us. For the rest of us, we're going to work for a pittance. We're not going to have any protections on the workplace or as consumers. And we will not have any services because they don't want to pay tax. So it's, more neo-feudal in character than neoliberal. And there's a fantastic book called Hayek's Bastards, written by Quinn Slobodian, that characterizes the neoliberal movement as a large chunk of it comes out of this sort of white supremacist, eugenicist idea that white genes or Western civilization are integral to a strong capitalist state and condition, and that the integration of libertarianism with that kind of racism is something that's a very strong trend in the movement, not necessarily recognized by the people perpetrating it now, but it's absolutely underpinning a lot of what's going on, and it's really come to the fore in the Trump era.
It is. I'm noticing all the tech overlords right now are really normalizing overt racism. We even saw Google put out an alert that said, learn more about the N word after the debacle at the BAFTAs, where a pro Palestine speech was censored, but someone allegedly with Tourette's that screamed out the N word was not censored from the delayed broadcast. So Elon Musk is
Well, I
flooding
think, can I
X.
just say, Dave, I think they definitely do have Tourette's. It was just that the BAFTAs or the
sure.
BBC didn't step in and censor what was, yes, reflexively, and without any fault associated with the person who called out as part of their Tourette's tics that word. But exactly to your point, if they had time to remove Free Palestine from Winner's speech, why could they not have got rid of that from the public broadcast? And they chose not to, and that's just inexplicable.
Yeah, I think it is explainable, though. I think this is part of this process of grotesque normalization of racism that we're all sort of experiencing right now. Joel, you've done some trawling through the Epstein files as well. There's an overlap with all of these people. And Lucy, your point originally about these people seeing communists everywhere, I think this is worth exploring a little bit, because communists don't appear in the Epstein files. If anything, they're ideologically opposed to this oligarchy that we're seeing at the moment globally. Either of you could jump in on this one.
Well, I'd like to go back to Lucy here, but, to speak about that Ayn Rand philosophy, and how that's kind of pervaded throughout that Milton Friedman era of like US thought making. And, very interested that you're saying that the whole neoliberalism project is kind of sprung out of this Atlas somewhere many years ago at the end of World War II. But I suppose I'm just like very interested in how that's evolved, into Silicon Valley. I remember watching an Adam Curtis documentary called Machines of Loving Grace or something like that. And it was about essentially that Ayn Rand philosophy going into Silicon Valley, like it was part of the early programming of Silicon Valley. And, people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs had these, Ayn Rand handbooks essentially as they wrote these new rules. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that. How has that evolved, where we get from that kind of more sober, realist way that the Atlas network would have worked in post-war to this like Peter Thiel, hyper accelerationism that's now the new sort of, the new philosophy.
It's a really interesting one. So you've got a few strands within the neoliberal thought space, and they were arguing it out over the years. So that's something to take into account. And the paleo-libertarians, who are characterized at the Mises or the von Mises Institute, are the ones really to watch, that they had this very racist, white supremacist, and incredibly strongly libertarian strain going, and that has fed quite strongly into the tech sphere. There's also a bunch of different networks at work. So one of the ones out there is the Council for National Policy, which began, was incorporated in the same year as Atlas, 1981. And that one is more sort of Christo-fascist or theocratic. So what they did with that one is, you might remember Jerry Falwell, together with some of the really hardcore extreme Republican operatives together, and they were the ones who created the moral majority, turned all these little churches into a giant voting base. They set up a whole lot of different media organizations that have been quite hidden from the mainstream Christian radio, Christian TV, that have had a huge influence. And so that's come through now to people like Bannon, Kirk, Pence. They're all involved with that. And so the Heritage Foundation and several of the think tanks that are connected to Atlas are also, and potentially originally connected more to the CNP. And we don't know to what degree, just interestingly as a side note for Australia, are Atlas Network think tank people integrated into these other sides of it. So that's something for us to watch.
Just on that
So
question,
with
so keep going. I'll come back to my
just with
question.
the tech bros, there's another newer think tank network called Rockbridge Network, which you can find on Wikipedia, and that was started in 2019. And that one's sort of meant to replace what they call the Koch network, which is the Atlas network. So there's also the Conservative Partnership Institute, which was supposed again to be a kind of post-Atlas thing with a whole lot of people coming out of heritage to set up a MAGA one. And Stephen Miller, the Nazi in the White House, comes out of that network. So there's a whole lot of different ones then, and it's hard to tell for sure how much they're at war with each other or how much they're actually sort of parts of the same organization.
That's what I wanted to ask just quickly before we go on, Joe. Yeah, before we go on, Joe, just quickly wanted to ask that, I have sort of witnessed some of that ideological competition happening within the right faction now. You do have that, and it's in the media, it's the Tucker Carlson faction versus, I suppose, the Mark Levin faction, I suppose. And there's this America First versus a more Zionist-centric policy, the legacy policy that's happening there. Does this threaten to cause some sort of schism within the right, like eventually, or does the Atlas network, aim to sort of contain everything neatly within some kind of overlap?
It's so hard to know because it's not really very transparent. So in 2021, they closed down the publishing of their partner lists. So Heritage claims to have left, and the Policy Exchange that Alexander Dana runs in London claims to have left. But there's all sorts of weird think tanks within it that have, like Claremont Institute, that's absolutely freaky fever swamp of racism, it's been described as, and linked to a militaristic fraternal order. Really strange. But it apparently seems to be still within the Atlas network sort of partnership list. So we just don't know for sure how much this is actual rebellions against what they call the Atlas sort of range of operations throughout DC, Conservative Inc. And it's hard to tell if it's a sort of a set of plausibly deniable operations or whether it's actually something that's a rebellion against and a denial of the old way that things worked since the Reagan era.
I mean, you
Can I jump in there with that, Drew?
Yeah, well, I was just sort of interested in linking it back to Australia. I mean, since you were last on the show, Lucy, we've seen the Senate inquiry into misinformation and disinformation, and your colleague Jeremy Walker giving evidence, getting into a bit of a spat with Matt Canavan, who claimed that he had never heard of the Atlas network and who were these sort of mysterious organizations about which Jeremy was talking. I mean, is it plausible that someone like Matt Canavan would be so clueless about this sort of right-wing network which is supporting him and his political party?
Look, it's certainly possible. They've tried to keep themselves relatively independent. And when Atlas Network think tanks were set up here, you had people like Morris Newman bringing Milton Friedman or Anthony Fisher out to speak to the kind of wannabe libertarian American style activists out here who went on to set up think tanks. And so they know they had connections, but they used local money and local people, which is the Atlas model. So it could well be, at one stage I was writing about what the Centre for Independent Studies was doing, and their comms director came onto quite a small news thread and said I was a tinfoil hat person and that the organisation was set up by a maths teacher in his garage. So Morris Newman just said at the Advance conference that he set it up together with 50,000 each from BHP and Shell and Western Mining and all that sort of thing.
Nowadays.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the two conferences that you talked about that were sort of Atlas adjacent, what were those organisations? What were those conferences, and who did we see being the headliners there?
So on Friday and Saturday of last week, we had the Advance conference, and that seemed to be a fairly in-house one. There are about 400 people there, and someone who was in there for us recording things said that it was a lot of older white men, but a posse, a posse of sort of 25 to 35-year-old ones who they said looked a bit like private school alumni. So I don't know if that's accurate,
That'd be
but
right.
it
Yeah.
was, yeah. So,
Breaking news.
well, the description of the Atlas Network's work in Latin America is that you've got the landed, whiter-skinned aristocracy fighting against First Peoples and redistributive justice movements in the decolonizing era. So, it does sound like a bit of a private school class activity, whether or not that's a fair description. So that one had a few strategic sessions, data sessions, messaging, all that sort of thing, as well as agenda setting. So they had someone from the Centre for Independent Studies talking about net zero, and Moira Deeming, the Victorian MP, was there talking about putting family at the centre of Australian policy, which is always a bit of a red flag in these circles.
It's always a code for we're about to bash trans people.
Or women,
Moira
generally.
Deeming,
Or women, yeah.
yeah, Moira Deeming comes out of abortion abolition movements originally. So whether she's bashing trans people because it's more socially acceptable as a message, I think, or whether she's actually moved beyond that earlier position, I can't say. So that's, part of it. But we also had three international guests. One was a conspiracy filmmaker who contributes to sites like Alex Jones. The other two were more worrying to my mind. So one came out of the Steve Bannon War Room business, and it's his chap in Rome who was setting up the gladiator school in the monastery just outside Rome that was supposed to train nationalists and interpret that the way you should, in the worst possible way, to become right-wing politicians and influencers to save the West from what this guy described as invaders. So his characterization is that Islam is oil and water with the West. The two are not reconcilable. That the audience's earlier parent immigrants came in ready to assimilate and to contribute, but that these new invaders come to conquer. And so it was really quite virulent and scary. So the War Room group has just co-hosted an event in January with the other speakers group, and he comes out of the American Freedom Alliance, which is a decades-old Islamophobic network member. So that's another of these networks, and it's been listed in the Centre for American Progress's Fear Inc. reports as being amongst coming out of the Family Foundation. That's one of the top 8 or so funders of Islamophobic propaganda from around about 2000. So the conference that they had in January hosted Geert Wilders, the far-right politician from Holland, and the material they've posted on their Instagram is just horrific. So the fact that this man he spoke mainly about China, but he did get onto remigration, which is the white supremacist term for mass deportation. And the fact that this man in particular got a visa is quite something that the Home Affairs Press Office refused to comment on. My thought is that they wouldn't have given a visa to someone from an anti-Semitic hate group.
No, I'm sure they wouldn't.
Be nice to think that.
What do you think of the implications then of Advance, who, let's remember back in 2019, I think it was, they were a joke that basically were, had big A's going around humping Zali Steggall's leg. They've now really been galvanized and are seemingly being used as a vehicle for big money, fossil fuel money, in particular, to come in, and they are having a major impact on our politics. We saw obviously through the referendum, but also in seats like Goldstein, and increasingly, particularly if the electoral laws stay as they are, they're an increasingly important additional vehicle through which dark money can be spent. So as they seemingly,
particularly with
they're already
Gina
right wing.
Reinhart.
Yeah, they've
Gina
always been
Reinhart
horrendous,
gave
of course.
900,000.
Yep.
900,000 is a lot of money for them to spend on this sort of stuff. And in the conference, they were claiming to have, tens of thousands, I think it was, Australians ready to hit the street to, work with them and campaign for them. So whether that's accurate or not, but they claim to be able to marshal quite a force numerically as well as in the dollars sense. So
Well, we haven't seen
it's
that yet, though,
unnerving.
because they have claimed that they were this sort of grassroots organisation, but when the AEC reporting happened, it wasn't that at all. It was astroturfing to the nth degree, and they were getting big chunks of money from wealthy people. So whether or not they are going to be able to get people out on the streets, I think, is still a moot point.
It's been interesting because obviously Twitter's a hive of Islamophobia at the moment, but it does. I've just been there long enough that the vibe is off. It does feel astroturfy. There's definitely money behind the onslaught that you cop, and I think it would be naive of us not to acknowledge that all this. A society in the West becoming more Islamophobic serves the needs of the American war machine. It serves the needs of the techno-fascists, and I think these two phenomena are inherently linked. We have warships headed towards Iran. Actually, this is good. Apparently, people aboard the largest American warship are mutinying, clogging the toilets deliberately. Now takes 45 minutes every single time at any time of the day if you want to go to the toilet on that ship. So they're stuck up shit creek, like almost literally.
They were lodged in a Greek port last time I checked. So I think they got the ship to berth after their objective was succeeded, throwing their shoes down the dunnies.
Really? So you have soldiers on board who are basically sabotaging their vessel.
This happened in Vietnam. It was called fragging, where people would kill their commissioned officers in the American army because they, as a protest for being in this hellhole for things they didn't believe in anymore. So I mean mutiny within the armed forces is not uncommon. Then also we should point out that this week is the second anniversary of Aaron Bushnell immolating himself in order to not be complicit with the Gaza genocide. So there is resistance inside this machine, but not enough to halt it right now.
Well, I mean, if you had
we don't really know.
you entirely,
with
you've
the
got
military build-up.
Go, Joel.
The other thing is that across the three of the two conferences, there were three speakers pushing for belligerence against China. So there's that going on out of this world as well.
And so, what was the second Atlas adjacent conference that you alluded to being on this week? So there was the advanced one.
So the last 2 days. The last 2 days, there was one called Aspire, which is the new version of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which is the one that Tony Abbott, John Anderson, Andrew Hastie, Jacinta Price, and a couple of others are connected to. And, John Howard. So that one has rebranded itself for the conference this year. And they had Josh Frydenberg saying that we had too high immigration, but too low quality, which was a particularly choice quote from him. And
that's a
so there's
group
more
catchphrase if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, grim. So they're really talking about it being a matter of national security to be more prejudiced and discriminatory in our immigration policy. So
that could potentially mean less, Muslim immigration and more immigration from, Israel's new potential massive strategic partner in India, of whom there was a nest of spies that ASIO had revealed here very recently. There are Hindutva extremists and, Zionist extremists working side by side together. In Iran, in the 12-day war, there were cases of Indian operatives being used by Mossad to essentially run, operations. So we are living in a really kind of, like a tectonic change period here. And it's coming at the time with like a confluence of AI control, mass data. We heard, Crikey put out a series of great articles about, the DHS demanding Australia hand over biometric and, voice recognition data as a part of a system that ICE will be able to essentially access. Cameron Wilson and Bernard Keane did some great articles in that space. And yeah, like we are looking at this kind of all-encompassing enshittification that is, slowly encroaching on us all. And that, that article that Dave and I strapped together, there was about maybe 12 or 13 days worth of content in that massive 3,000 word article. I mean, the wheel is turning very quickly, and some of these things in isolation might seem, asinine or something like that, end up being, quite consequential when stacked against everything else. So it's, it's a real nasty time, Lucy, Dave, and Joe.
Mm. How did it play out at the Aspire conference? It's obviously that is much more heavily populated by current and former politicians directly associated with and representing the two major coalition partners.
Absolutely. So there was Moira Deeming and Alex Antic, who then went on to meet up with Cory Bernardi from One Nation within Sky's camera view a couple of days later to look like he was discussing moving across, I guess. So, interesting coming out of that. But it was definitely much more the mainstream politicians and a more kind of dignified audience. So a lot of it's been handed out via Murdoch's The Australian, which made itself the, I guess, unofficial partner of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship last year in London, and this year has done quite a lot of officially transcripts of speeches and logo and minute-by-minute coverage of the conference. So I think it's that and Teal's project, National Conservatism, which brings together Jewish nationalists and Hindutva nationalists together with Christian nationalists to be able to reinforce each other's project. That I think this falls within that same banner, and you can see that kind of nationalism at work in the Aspire conference, with John Howard saying that we get everything from our Judeo-Christian heritage.
It's kind of, I mean, I'm interested in Alex Antic because he has been absolutely the vehicle through which we've seen a vast injection of Pentecostal representation within the South Australian Liberal Party, and that's why you've seen this very anti-woman, anti-abortion, pro-forced birth activism happening in South Australia. It has no chance of succeeding with the Labor government, but it did very nearly get through the upper house as a result of conservative activism, including by being led by the guy who's now the shadow treasurer down there, Ben Hood. And yes, as you say, Alex Antic has been sort of ostentatiously being seen in public with Cory Bernardi. They were having a beer outside the Exeter Hotel, which is not somewhere where you go if you don't want to be seen. But I'd be surprised if he does make the leap. He may be ideologically aligned with One Nation, but I think he's less likely to get elected to anything with One Nation. And where he sits at the moment atop of the coalition ticket in South Australia seems to be a much safer place for him to be.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it was for show. Yeah. Sorry, I think it was for show.
Joel.
Yeah, Lucy, just following on from Joe there, I did want to ask, a little bit about, if there's a bit of a disjointed connection between this, Northern Hemispheric Atlas movement and the conservative movement in Australia, which has its own nuances. And, I spend a bit of time on both sides of politics, looking around at things. And I do see that there's a bit of a disjointed, connection with a lot of this American conservative crap. You see many people, even the Australian, influencers influencers and people online who are just sort of verbatim copying crap from somewhere in America, and it doesn't seem to have the buy-in from a lot of like Australia first, conservative kind of people. And maybe that recipe is going to be found with a true Australian fascist one day. But I suppose, yeah, I wanted to ask if there is a bit of an issue with that message, cutting across.
The main difference seems to be in support for Ukraine, with the MAGA movement very much for Russia and the Australian version still standing by Ukraine. But it'll be really interesting to see how it works. I think the very religious and fringe sound of the American MAGA politics doesn't necessarily cut through here yet. And I think Advance is hoping that they can use immigration to galvanise more people in the outer suburbs in the country. And of course, that what was Sky News is now free to air into the country. So I think they're hoping that
That's
these
an Aussie
industries
favourite too.
Look,
Yeah,
I want
well,
to add to the conversation that the reason why these movements are given clear runway in this country is basically because the Labor Party is refusing to address and acknowledge the reality of the rot of late stage capitalism of where we're at. People are actually stressed. I talked to Jordan Vanderlam. He's dealing with people that are now society's outgroup. Traditionally, they would have been included. They would have been happy, white, middle class-ish houses, the whole thing. This class of person increasingly doesn't exist anymore, and they're agitated. And it's valid. It is completely valid. Pauline Hanson has just announced that she's going to tax the gas companies. Now, I don't actually think she's going to do this, but it is a very smart wedge given the scenario that I've just outlined, where there actually is a huge chunk of middle Australia that does want Gina Rinehart taxed better, that does understand that's the source of their real oppression right now, not immigrants.
And they're cracking the code, right, Dave? With, they're throwing the money at it and they're slowly cracking the code and getting the formulas right. And, you have Andrew Hastie talking about Tiranas and like working in the factories in the 60s and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, there's a flavor being developed.
Yeah, whereas the ALP is just going to seem disconnected like corporate Democrats in the United States. And they believe their only move is to normalize this racism and go with it. And it's a recipe for disaster, as far as I can tell.
Well, I do think that is where Farah is going to be so interesting, because it will be a test of whether or not the polls suggesting there's a surge of support for One Nation, and certainly seem to be things on the ground indicating that there are disaffected voters from coalition parties, but it also seems to be the case that there are now starting to be really maybe not massive, but nonetheless statistically significant numbers of former Labor voters who are flirting with One Nation, because there doesn't seem to be within the major parties any mood to deal with the fundamental problems and questions that they are confronting. And people can say cost of living as if giving another little handout to help with the electricity bill in this particular quarter is the answer, as opposed to a fundamental restructure of our tax system and indeed potentially more broadly our economy. I think, Lucy, it is interesting because Advance, Atlas, they're all trying to tap into that sense of grievance, and that's what got Trump elected. But of course, once they achieve power, the right have absolutely no interest in actually tackling any of the problems, and indeed want to maintain the oligarchical power and elite rule. So you would think that at some point there would have to be something giving here. You can't fool all the people all the time.
You would hope not, but Alex Carey, the Australian sociologist who tracked the movement from basically the First World War, of using what he called business propaganda to manage the democratic threat to profits, showed that over and over again, they'd come out with some big funding campaign, and within 6 months, they could completely turn the public around against things like the Office of Price Control, I think it was called in the US after the Second World War, where they stopped businesses price gouging. 6 months to completely reverse sort of 20-something opposition to the thing to 20-something support for it. The government trashed the office, and people got prices went through the roof. So, again and again, they run these things on us, and we keep falling for them. So I hope you're right, but I don't know.
It's truly alarming and fascinating how malleable, how managed we seem to be by this class of person, and how we do keep falling for it. I think we need to look into the psychological aspects of that. I think are fascinating. Joel, what were you about to say, mate?
Well, look, Australia has been putting its faith in Tweedledee and Tweedledum for some time now, and sort of falling back on that. So we haven't been going for demagogues forever. It's not sort of something we've been doing, essentially or fundamentally. And there is a real shift happening. Like I did some sociology fishing up the New South Wales coast, and I spoke to a lot of people on the rocks there were voting for One Nation. And we had a lot of discussions about why One Nation was an important, option for them. And in many cases, it's a protest vote, and it doesn't have the same. I suppose, like weight on it that the coalition does. And many people are sort of navigating to it because they think it's a nimble option that stands for something. Well, I mean, we're all educated that it's just the same version of something else that is just as Zionist, if not more Zionist, that is just as linked to the corporate class. But many people are so fed up with this duopoly Tweedledee, Tweedledum thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's shame on the left for not developing a viable alternative, because it wouldn't take much to pull a lot of these people across. But, there's a good chance, Joe, I think they could win that election. And it'll be a shock to many, but I think it's going to keep coming. And to the point where, the two mainstream parties are going to be shitting themselves come next election.
Well, I wonder what the role of the community independent, Michelle Milthorpe, could be in all of this, because clearly the community independents have been positioning themselves as disrupting the major parties, but very much from the sensible centre. So, how that then plays out, I think, is actually going to be pretty critical for
Sure.
the next federal election. This sense that the independents perhaps didn't do as well in the 25 election as they had done in the 22 election. But in fact, there were about 10 other campaigns, community independent campaigns, which, when all of the votes had been counted, had come closer to knocking off a major party than Nicolette Buller did in Bradfield in 22. And everybody then recognised that she had positioned herself very well to be within striking distance at the next election. Now, because there weren't as many actual victories, and that sense that there's no second place in politics, perhaps that's gone a little bit under the radar. But in many seats, including in Farrer, the community independents are very well positioned, better positioned, as I say, than Buller in Bradfield in 25, and could make real inroads. But that is going to require forcing their way back into the national conversation, which is currently and somewhat bizarrely dominated by this splintering of the right and the implications for that of One Nation. A lot of that is driven by media as well, the same kind of normalisation of Hanson that saw her on Dancing with the Stars and, on morning television, that brought her back into prominence when she had become almost a political joke, who was just sort of running in whatever seat she could to try and boost the coffers again. But she hadn't been taken seriously for a long time until bit by bit she sort of worked her way back into the public consciousness. Now, that seems to be what's happening now. I mean, prominence begets more prominence, begets, more percentage points in the polls. And I think that's where the community independents have a bit of work to do. Now that the by-election will be called, now that Susan has in fact resigned, to try and disrupt what is shaping up as almost sort of a fait accompli that One Nation is going to be, if not successful in securing the seats, certainly very successful in the number of votes they attract.
I mean, they'll need to hit the streets and do it old school because they will never get the same sort of coverage from the mainstream press. And like the sad truth of the reality of that, just the conditioned nature of it, all our minds, as we've been talking about, a certain number of us just think the people we see on TV are our friends and we vote for them because of that. We develop parasocial relationships with these people. And we're really quite easy to manipulate in that sense. But yeah, if the community independents are going to win, they're going to need to be marching the streets and talking to everybody. They've got, yeah.
Well, I
That's
guess
that's Dennis Ginnivan's patch too, right? That's Dennis Ginnivan's patch out there. If anyone's going to do it out there, it's him and his people. So yeah, hopefully they get some action.
I mean, it's two different. It's like two halves. There's Albury, and then there's the rest of the seat. So I think Millthorpe did very well in Albury, but we'll be hitting the streets in the rest of the seat to, try and swing it, because I think they do have to do well there. And that, I guess, Lucy, will be a test of whether or not Advance and those sorts of organisations can make an impact, because they're not, from what we've seen and what we've already discussed, they're not that great at the old school analogue campaigning, door knocking. It's much more about just sort of swooping in and spending money.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. I think we just have to make sure that we're watching, into 2 or 3 election campaigns, not just one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. The timelines here matter. I think we as progressive individuals need to sort of reconceptualize what winning looks like a little bit, because I would say that if we keep One Nation out, but the Labor Party enacts their policies and their rhetoric, like that's not really much of a victory. I don't see that as a win whatsoever.
But also, I think the left needs to sort of reframe its sanctimony and the way it embraces ideas. I mean, this is what the right does so well. It's able to kind of get together with all sorts of different ideas and potentially different ideological endgames, but they work out how they can work together. And the left really struggles in that category. And we need to sort of have discussions on the left about things like neoliberal immigration, for example, so we can offer like alternative discussions to what the right's bringing up, which is just flat out racism. We need to identify some of the big structural issues that are affecting us all.
I don't know if I think we have the talking points. I think we know what to say. We just don't know how to say it because lots of us are just dysregulated and stressed. And there's definitely a class of person that's about moral superiority rather than helping. And I'll tell you, nowadays you get attacked by absolutely everybody when you write absolutely anything. That's just the thing. But it is more annoying getting attacked by left-wing people than Zionists, because it is coming from what this person perceives to be as a place of I am helping, but it's the opposite of that. It's just situating oneself as a morally superior and I guess deflating everybody else that's doing real work. It's it is a real problem, not just in this country, but across the world.
But I guess that's sort of to Lucy's main point, isn't it? That the right have been not just incredibly good at, but incredibly methodically organised around developing propaganda that they then feed through all of these different channels, all of which have the same ultimate big picture goal, even as sometimes the different routes and emphases from particular organisations within or underneath that overall banner may differ. And that has been, as you say, Lucy, a decades-long project that it seems the left really has only woken up to in the last, couple of decades at the absolute most.
I think the left felt like we were, moral arc bending towards justice and all that sort of thing, and that we were on that roll and it was just going to keep going. And the right decided that the left had won and they were going to take the left's models and rework them. And so the Atlas Network and all that sort of thing came out of things that they saw the left doing. And they've been incredibly focused. And Steve Baxter at the Advance Conference, who flagged himself as representing the Libertarian Party, which is linked to the Atlas Network. He was talking about how he's using startup funding to send 20 Australian kids to CPAC America, which is the heart of MAGA, and how he's also funding content producers around the world who make what he calls centre-right, but far-right-ish, free market, free speech, he said, material. And he said that you will affect the Australian ideas landscape by bringing it in from outside. So they're really strategic.
Yeah.
And Lucy, those same groups that are organising and funding this, they've also used that funding to splinter and divide the left through their, junk tanks and things like that they've thrown out at us. So yeah, we have everything against us, but we've got all the people. So let's try and work out how we can figure that one out.
Yes. Well, it's just a shame. It's hard because so many of the billionaires are just fucking evil. And you're going to have more evil money on the right than you're going to have massive good money on the left. So
it's inherent. It's just inherent that that's how it works. We will never have more money. We will never have more media reach. We will never have these massive propaganda tools that they have. We just have truth and not being a dickhead to each other. That's kind of it.
And that's where those sort of analog campaigning techniques that people engage in so much around elections are probably all we've got left. In some ways. Dave,
some of these protests too.
We are coming towards the end of the show, but I just wondered if there was any of the, really just gargantuan list of horror that you included in your massive article that you wanted to particularly draw to our attention as being emblematic in some ways of what we're up against.
I mean, the collage, the pattern, I think, is the thing that people need to cling on to rather than individual incidents. But I am, the two things that I think really stand out for me is the Zionist overhaul of our primary and high school education and universities. I find that concept, frankly, terrifying. I will not stand for my child being indoctrinated to have a normalized relationship with Israeli depravity. I'm just not going to do it.
And how is that manifesting itself then, this interference in the education system?
Well, we don't know that. They've begun a 12-month inquiry headed up by Gonski, who I've also found quotes to suggest he's a Zionist as well. And, we will see, but I don't think we need to be Hercule Poirot to work out the intent at this point. I really don't. And then the other aspect is the encroaching police state, the Palantir aspect. Actually, I should ask you, Lucy, do you know anything much about Palantir that we're not aware about that we should be across? Because it's a dystopic, it's the villain from the X-Men movies. It's a terrifying corporation.
It is, and it's run by Peter Thiel. And so what you've got with him is someone who is a Christian nationalist. He is post-democratic, doesn't believe it works. He's a fossil fuel fan and climate denier. One of his first gigs out of college was in an Atlas Network think tank called the Independent Institute, where he wrote a book against woke and identity politics. And he is, I think, much more extreme now than he was then. And he's part of the race science circle that may have been influenced by Epstein. And the Australian politics that I talked about in the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship seem to be part of a Peter Thiel operation there. So in the UK, that operation has got a whole lot of contracts within the British state. And connected into
including over nuclear systems, Lucy. I just saw that so they have a cloud computing contract now over nuclear systems in the UK.
Great.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Did anyone see the little nugget that
I'll just follow. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say real quick, the Pentagon has been running military workshops, trainings with AI that 95% of the time does recommend nuclear strikes. That's its go-to option. Joel, jump in.
I'm writing about that now. So yeah, we're all talking about this. I'm talking about that broken system, the logic factor of these machines that we're placing all of our, water and electricity into isn't really there. And the business case is actually, sort of evaporating a little bit for the open AIs and things like that. They're already talking about things like advertising and things. So I want to talk about how how, the big issue being the acquiescence of our, human governments to these kind of machine entities, this techno-feudalism. That includes handing over our biometric data, just the fact that we're shelling out contracts to these tech lords post-Epstein, many of whom have got, direct links with this stuff. And also how we're just allowing the Trump administration to really screw into us, into our digital sovereignty. It's just been an absolute mind blower looking into that. So keep your head up.
Well, yeah, and it seems that we are absolutely going down the same path where the government's missed the opportunity to appropriately regulate social media and big tech in that area, and we're now doing it all over again with AI, with potentially far-reaching consequences from a broad point of view, but also in a very practical point of view. We don't have enough scope at the moment to be building all the houses that we need, but we can certainly keep building data centers. We can farm off energy that's required for all sorts of parts of our economy to be sucked up there. We can hand over water to be used in these data centers as well. There's now more money going into the construction of data centers than there is in offices, in a whole range of other kind of infrastructure. So, it's like happening all over again.
Our ruling class would not be spending that much money if they didn't think they could eliminate the need for a ton of jobs.
Well, there's a lot of jobs that have already been earmarked to go.
And it'll get worse.
So we'll see. But look, we have reached the end of a show. I don't know if did we ask people about top tips? Has anyone got a top tip that they'd like to share that's coming up in this week ahead? Joel, anything you're keeping your eye on? No?
Top tip. That was the top tip. Essentially watch out for the tech panopticon. Yeah.
And I think, Lucy, I mean, you're diving deep into all of these sorts of organizations and individuals and the implications of them, so we don't have to. So we're very grateful to you for your work and for your colleague Jeremy Walker, and it'll be particularly interesting, I guess, to see what the Senate does come up with when they report back on that inquiry into mis and disinformation.
Absolutely. And if anyone's interested in more background about how Atlas Network became integrated into Australia and its history, Gareth Hutchins from the ABC did a brilliant article on it around about Australia Day, I think. So get hold of that.
Oh, that it seemed to be that it was finally breaking into the mainstream.
Was that the one with Hayek and the massive bull? Yeah. I love that. Okay, I never knew about that one.
Seek that one out. We will be back next week. We're going to try and do a bit of a South Australian election special next week, as long as we can line up the guests, because that election is coming up on March the 21st, and there'll be a few interesting things to watch there around the very subjects of conversation that we've been having today. Please do think about subscribing to our channel, think about giving us some money, all of that kind of thing. Dave, you've got a top tip that I didn't come back to you.
I don't have a top tip, but I am getting emails about the sold out t-shirts. I've ordered some more.
Oh, yeah. We've got more merch on its way. So do keep an eye out for that too, because they're fantastic. Thanks to Fiona.
My top tip is buy a t-shirt.
Buy a t-shirt for us. That will also be very helpful. But thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.